Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. And today is truly a red letter day, right? Our introduction to verbs of motion. So I've been talking about this, I've been building it up for days now, and let's see if it lives up to its billing. Okay, yeah, so I've mentioned already this is one of the hardest topics in Russian grammar. We know already that Russian verbs are not exactly a cakewalk, right? Uh, and let's think for a moment, why are Russian verbs generally so difficult? Well, because, the main reason is the aspectual distinction, right? We don't have anything like that in English, right? So we've got to learn verbs as pairs and, are they imperfective or perfective? And then we've got to know when to use one versus the other. Okay, so there's that. Now, today that's going to continue to be a problem, right? We're always going to be thinking about aspect when we're using Russian verbs, but we're looking at verbs that have not simply two infinitives, as we've seen already, but rather three infinitives. And in a nutshell, that's what makes a verb of motion a verb of motion. It's a verb that has three basic infinitives. Now, let's just be clear. There's a lot to say today. It's almost hard to know what order to take these things in. But when we use the term verbs of motion in this textbook, and just from now on in this course, we don't mean all Russian verbs that involve motion. I mean, as you might imagine, there are any number of Russian verbs that involve motion. Like, let's take, for example, falling, or, it could be other things like swinging, various action verbs that involve motion. Well, none of those verbs are going to be called verbs of motion because they just come in ordinary aspectual pairs. There's nothing really unusual about them, right? So when we use the phrase verbs of motion or motion verbs, we mean hard verbs. Why are they so hard? Because they have three infinitives we have to choose among, right? Now, again, this is one of those things in Russian. It's always useful generally to try to keep in mind, distinguish between what is, maybe there's nothing really easy in Russian, I guess, but what is just kind of normal and what is really difficult. Okay, so these things today, these verbs of motion, are quite difficult indeed, and you'll see why today. Okay, so again, think verbs of motion, three infinitives, three infinitives. Um, now, before we look at examples, let's look at a quick photograph, right? To review our what we learned yesterday in day 35, right? Лично Гитлеру в Berlin, right? Personally, лично, that's just an adverb. Гитлеру, that's a dative, almost as if addressing this bomb, right? As if addressing a letter to someone. В Berlin. Okay, look at Berlin. Is that a где phrase, an откуда phrase, a куда phrase? That is a куда phrase, right? To Berlin. Now remember, the где equivalent would be в Berlinie, right? In Berlin, right? But this bomb isn't in Berlin, it's going to Berlin, right? It's going to be dropped on Berlin and it's meant for Hitler, right? Okay, so there's a nice little historical photo, right? You can understand all of the grammar in that photo now. Isn't that nice? Now, look at this guy over here just having a smoke while they paint graffiti on bombs, right? I hope that's safe. I don't know, but anyway. Okay. So Russian verbs of motion. When we say verbs of motion, we mean difficult verbs that have three infinitives, right? Not to put too fine a point on it. Okay, let's look at some examples here. This table shows us a couple of ordinary verbs of the kind we've been dealing with so far, right? Like читать, прочитать, писать, написать. Of course, they come in aspectual pairs, right? Just two infinitives, like the vast majority of Russian verbs. But if we look over, we see our first examples of verbs of motion. The verb for going by foot is ходить, идти, пойти. Three infinitives. Now, note how we're marking these up, right? Look at the forward slash. That's marking, as always, the division between imperfective and perfective. Okay, so how many of these three infinitives are imperfective? Two, right? Ходить, идти, then the slash, then our perfective verb пойти. Okay, going by vehicle. Now, you can already note that we're distinguishing between types of motion, right? Going by vehicle is a different verb than simply going on foot, walking. That set of infinitives is ездить, ехать, поехать. Ездить and ехать are both imperfective. Поехать is perfective. Okay, now you can probably already tell what the real issue is today. We have two imperfective verbs, so what is the difference between those two imperfective verbs? Okay, well, you can guess there has to be some distinction or there wouldn't be two separate words, right? So that's what we're going to have to talk about. And to explain that, we're going to have to introduce a new category, right? Now, let's just think for a moment. We already know about aspect, and you see the forward slash separating the imperfective side from the perfective side, right? So now it's within the imperfective where we have two infinitives. That's where we need to introduce the further category to distinguish between these two imperfective infinitives. That category is determinacy, right? The first verb in the table, like chadit, is indeterminate. The second infinitive in this set of three is determinate. And then the third one, paiti, that's the perfective infinitive for this set. Ездить is indeterminate, ехать determinate, and поехать is perfective. Okay, so again, main thing maybe to note at this point is that ходить and идти are both imperfective by definition, right? They're not, one of them is not somehow more imperfective than the other. They are both by definition completely, fully imperfective. The difference is not aspectual, but rather the distinction of indeterminate versus determinate. Okay, let's talk about what that means. It sounds like a bit of a fancy term. Well, we're going to do this in this book at least early on, right? Until we really get a sense of what these verbs mean. We're going to have to be a little bit creative. We're going to tackle this in a couple of ways. We're going to not simply unpack verbs of motion. Sorry, we're not going to simply translate verbs of motion. We're going to do what I like to call unpacking the verbs. When I use the term unpack in this course, I usually mean something more like giving perhaps a longer, very literal, very careful translation that may sound kind of unnatural in English, but that really nails the meaning of the Russian, right? And you can do that quite often in English. We've seen a few cases where you can't, like with certain subjectless expressions, but quite often you can take a tricky Russian verb or whatever and give some English that may not sound like something we'd ever say, but that makes perfectly good sense and that really just nails the meaning of the Russian. Now, the problem here generally is that translation doesn't help. And of course, that's true with language in general. It's not really always a good idea to be translating sort of back and forth. You want to kind of learn the new language on its own terms. But of course, for beginners, it's almost inevitable that you're going to be comparing. If we were simply to translate most of these motion verbs, we would very, very often end up with some form of the verb to go, right? To go, to go, to go, to go, 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 go. Okay, the problem is that, as we've seen already, Russian verbs of motion are more complicated. They're more complex, they're more precise, right? So whereas we would just basically lazily use the verb to go in English, again, not always, but very, very often. In Russian, we've got to draw more careful distinctions in terms of the type of motion we're actually talking about. So Russian is going to be more specific about the way it describes motion, and that's what we've got to get used to as English speakers. If we fall back onto the English translation of to go, then of course we're going to fail to see the distinctions between these three Russian infinitives. For example, with the verb for motion by foot, ходить, идти, пойти. Now let's just think, it's obvious, right? Those three verbs mean different things. Otherwise, there wouldn't be the three verbs to begin with, right? So that's our problem, right? What is the difference? What does a Russian imagine when they hear the verb ходить versus what they imagine just spontaneously when they hear the verb идти or пойти? Three very different pictures spring to mind when they hear these three different verbs that are describing different types of motion. Okay, so how are we going to unpack these verbs? The way we might begin doing that is with words, right? And what I like to call keywords. Okay, so the the key word for indeterminate verbs is around. And that begins to give us a pretty good idea of what indeterminate verbs like ходить are describing. They're describing, let's think about what the word indeterminate means, right? Sort of undetermined, indeterminate in the sense that we're not really going anywhere. We're not getting anywhere. We're sort of moving aimlessly without a clear sense of a destination or progress or anything, right? And we can see how from that kind of fancy term indeterminate, we could get a more, kind of practical keyword around. Okay, so ходить means to go on foot around. Okay, what can that mean? It can mean to go in circles, almost literally just walking in circles. It can mean to kind of stroll around aimlessly, like I was walking around the park, right? And again, you see how this is indeterminate, right? You're just kind of aimlessly moving around. Okay, that's around also. Or as we'll see later, it could also involve the idea of a round trip. Now, there, of course, the word is slightly different, making a round trip, but it's still the idea of around captures it pretty nicely. You're going somewhere, right? That's trip A, and then you're completing the trip. You're making a full round trip, and you see how that sort of closes off the circle. You can also think of it as sort of more linear, but in any case, you're sort of closing the circle, so to speak. You're getting the idea of going around by foot. The verb, let's take the second verb in the movement motion by foot set. That verb is idти. That's the determinate verb. Okay, now determinate, we can see what that means, right? Indeterminate meant without any clear destination or progress. Determinate means, right, you're sort of getting somewhere. You're on a journey, you're heading towards, usually some type of destination, although we'll talk about that more in a little while. Okay, so what's our keyword for determinate verbs like idti? Our keyword is underway, underway. Okay, so what does idti mean? It means to be underway by foot, to be underway by foot. Okay, so ходить is to go around, walk around on foot. Idти is to be underway by foot. Okay, hopefully you can see already what a clear difference there is between those two types of motion. And a little mini rant here. These keywords nail down the meaning of the Russian exactly. They are absolutely, what happens with these verbs of motion is they're so confusing that a lot of books, a lot of teachers will try to simplify them, right? They'll want to give you a couple of rules of thumb. They do a very sloppy job with it. And as I mentioned before, for a lot of students, that might be perfectly good if all you want to do is go to Moscow for a couple of days and, use some tourist Russian or whatever. But that's not what we're here for, is it, right? We're serious. We want to really one day be speaking, reading Russian fluently. We want to really understand what's going on in Russian. That's why we're being very careful to draw these different distinctions. But you often hear things thrown out. I've heard this so many times that, if I had $5 for every time, I'd be a millionaire, right? It's impossible to teach verbs of motion, right? It's just impossible. They're so complicated that a non-Russian will never understand what they really mean or something like this. Which my first response is, well, then why even try, right? If it's literally impossible, then why on earth did we make people sign up for language classes? It's not impossible. And these little keywords, which I basically cooked up myself, maybe someone else has used something like this. I don't really know, but I just cooked them up myself after years of suffering, right? Because what I was fed was sort of rules of thumb, which work some of the time, but not always. I may return to this topic later on subsequent days when we have more time. Right? What are various ways people try to use to explain verbs of motion that kind of work a little bit, but not totally. And then later on, down the road, students realize, oh, I don't really understand these at all, really. So they try to simplify them, and again, you realize ultimately that you don't really understand what the difference is, and you don't really know how to use them in every different situation. Okay, so to me, I've always found this a bit puzzling because you can use these little keywords and they really pretty much nail down the meaning, the distinction between these verbs. Ходить is to go on foot, right? All these infinitives, three infinitives, ходить, идти, пойти, they all mean going by foot, right? They all have the same basic meaning in terms of the action they're describing, but now the distinction is, first of all, between determinacy, going around, right? In circles, aimlessly, round trip. That's ходить. Идти is being underway, right? You have this sense not of aimlessness, but of being on your way somewhere, however vague that may be. You have this sense of forward progress. Underway really nails that, right? I mean, is it me, right? To me, it just, you're on your way somewhere, you're underway. Everyone knows what that means. Now, so let's take the final verb, the perfective one, that's пойти. Пойти, and we'll talk more about this later, that means setting off. That'll be our key word for пойти, to, someone still, they're not moving, and пойти means to set off, right? Okay, so setting off is our main keyword. We'll talk more about that later. There's more to say about that. Okay, now, so let's step back for a moment. What happens is, I cast out these pearls, these beautiful keywords that are so useful. And God knows, I wish someone had told me these keywords back when I was in college. When did I start Russian? As a sophomore. They work every time they're tried, right? So this is kind of frustrating as a teacher sometimes, right? I do this and we practice it. We'll practice it a lot today. And then later, tomorrow we'll see the verb et and I'll be like, what does this mean? Or maybe we're trying to choose between ходить and идти, and students, of course, have no idea because they're thinking English, go, 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 oh my God. And I'm like, well, are we going around or underway, right? And if we make that distinction, we have those sort of keywords to latch on to, then the choice is usually really obvious. Some disgusting insect crawling down my wall. These things that have they're not centipedes, they're not millipedes, but they've got 200 legs. They're disgusting. I don't even know what they're called. I'm in this old kind of crumbling Gothic building, and so you see all sorts of creatures in here. Okay. I should use a motion verb to describe what I just saw, but anyway. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so again, the tendency is students just, for whatever reason, they refuse to just use the keyword, right? And it makes things so much easier. Okay, so again, ходить is to go around, идти is to be underway, пойти is to set off on foot. Okay, so we'll practice that unpacking stuff today and for the next several days. But of course, you don't want to sit there like some kind of I don't know, half-wit and be unpacking, going back and forth between these English phrases and Russian, right? You don't want to live like that. At some point, you're going to have to just use Russian spontaneously, right? And you've seen already how easy it is to go from this kind of crutch, this kind of keyword, right, around to just simply drawing a picture, sort of, right? You could draw a picture in the air with your finger or on the page, or maybe I've always wished that we could get sparklers in class, right? And maybe turn the lights out and draw pictures with sparklers. Okay. So we can unpack these verbs, or we can do what we can look at what I'll refer to as pictograms, right? A pictogram, just maybe a little circle, right? So next to ходить in the table, you'll see a little circle. That's kind of pretty much what ходить is describing in essence, right? Next to et, we see just a little arrow, right? Just getting across that very basic idea that we're on our way. We have a sense of progress, right? Of whatever kind. And then for πt, we'll have a little line, which just is kind of underscoring that we're stationary, and then off we go, right? Another arrow coming off of this line, meaning we're still, and then we're setting off we go. Okay, so again, if we rely on these keywords, and then maybe even more ideally, these mental images, these pictograms, that's really the best way to nail down the differences between these verbs. Now we think about the pictograms, they're so useful because that's really what Russians do, right? I mean, we hear words, they conjure up some idea in our head, especially when we have context, someone's telling a story or whatever, they're painting a mental picture, right? So again, when a Russian hears the verb ходить, based on context, they're going to be thinking of something like this, right? Going around, round trip, something of that nature. they hear the verb iti, they're thinking, oh, someone's on their way, right? They're, again, in some crude sense, visualizing a kind of arrow, right? Okay, so let's really, really try to nail down, just use the keywords. Around, underway, setting off. If you just use those and form good habits, these motion verbs actually are not all that difficult, at least in terms of the big picture. Okay, so let's move on now. I've been blathering. Let's look at indeterminate motion verbs. Okay, so let's focus on the first two infinitives, right? And we've got two types of motion, right? Motion by foot, motion by vehicle. Okay, so for motion by foot, we have ходить, идти. And for motion by vehicle, we have, again, two imperfectives, ездить, ехать. Okay, so again, two types of motion, two imperfective verbs. We see that up at the top, just reviewing, right? These are both, all four of these verbs are imperfective. That means they can describe ongoing action, repeated action, attempt, right? You know, this motion is ongoing, it's underway, maybe it's an attempt to get somewhere. Right, so they're all imperfective. Now, below that, we get the further breakdown, right, between indeterminate versus determinate. You see our pictograms, you see our keywords, ходить and ездить describe motion around, right? Ходить is to go by foot. How? Around, right? To walk around. Ездить is to go by vehicle indeterminately, right? That is around. Идти is determinate. That's to go by foot, underway, right? You are underway by foot. That's how we can unpack that verb, and it really just nails the meaning of the Russian. Ехать means to be underway by vehicle. Okay, so you see some more examples here, right? Now, again, these are both imperfective, so let's look at a couple of possible meanings. Ходить can mean to be going around, right? To be walking around on foot, or ездить can mean to be going around by vehicle. It can also mean to make a round trip. Идти and ехать can describe ongoing action, right? Present tense action. You are underway, ongoing action. Or you see another way we can use these pictograms. What if we have repeated action? Well, as kind of a little mental exercise, we could just draw the pictogram twice or three times or four times or whatever to show that we've got the same basic motion, for example, going around or making a round trip, and here we're repeating it, right? Or maybe we're on our way somewhere and we're repeating it, right? For example, every day in the morning at 8 o'clock, I'm on my way to class. Well, if we do that every morning, then we get a repeated underway motion, and we could visualize that by repeating our little pictogram of the arrow. Okay, so let's take a first stab at this. Today we're introducing the system, and we'll talk about this a lot more in the coming days. Verbs of motion, for the most part, are quite systematic, and we've already seen the gist of that, right? You have sets of three infinitives for each type of motion. Each of the three infinitives means something quite different, and we've just discussed what those basic differences are. So they're really quite systematic in that sense. They're fairly consistent, and they kind of form an elegant system. Unfortunately, we're going to see instances where the system breaks down a little bit, and we get these weird exceptions. We're going to call those breakdowns, right? So we really have kind of two jobs, two jobs with verbs of motion. We've got to first learn the system. That's what we're focused on today, and we'll spend 3 more days talking about it. We've got to just learn how that works generally, and then we've got to, on the other hand, worry about these special instances where something a little bit weird happens, something a little bit unexpected that we could think of as a breakdown of the system because it tends, or at least it seems, to contradict the system. Okay, so let's look at our first set of examples. Now, again, this is one of those things, sort of like with aspect, it's a little bit hard to think of exercises in a textbook. What I usually do is just go from some English, very short English phrases, and obviously we're not going to have a whole lot of context here, so there may be cases where there's maybe some ambiguity, but basically we're just looking at this English phrase. We're trying to get the gist of it, and we're trying to think, what is the type of motion involved here? Are we going around or are we underway? And remember, it's based on that distinction that we're going to choose a Russian infinitive to work with. Okay, so let's do that right now. And again, you can, in the exercise in the book, you could write down the keyword. I might start by doing that. And then also you could draw a little pictogram just to make sure you're visualizing what the Russian's really saying. Now, remember, if all you do is sort of translate, or you see one of these words and you think, oh, well, that just means to go. Well, that's not all that it means, right? We're distinguishing between the type of motion, right, on foot versus on vehicle, and also, right, is it determinate or indeterminate? Okay, you're headed to class right now. Okay, again, please, I'm begging you, use the keywords, right? Use the keywords. What would make more sense right now? Around or underway? You're headed to class right now. Underway, right? Of course, this is pretty obvious to me at least, right? Maybe I've been doing this too long. Okay? Again, we could even sort of paraphrase this. I'm on my way to class right now. Okay, so what Russian verb would describe that? Right now we're just picking the infinitives. That's идти, идти. That is to be underway by foot. Okay, number two, you go to class every day. Okay, well, underway doesn't really seem to work, right? Because it's not that you're on your way to class every day, but that you go to class every day. Now, here's maybe a good first example, right? You see the verb to go, and you see how it really isn't helping us very much. What if we say I go to class every day? What are we really saying if we think about that motion the way a Russian would think about it, right? According to these categories. Well, we're doing this, right? Not only do we go to class every day, we come home from class every day. We're making repeated round trips, right? So that's a really good example. We're going to see that type of thing over and over, right? Whenever round trips are implied, we have to use, in this case, ходить, right? You walk to class every day. You go to class every day. That's ходить. There and back again, right? The Hobbit. There and back again. Okay, number three. You used to go to Russia once per year. Okay, well, let's think. Well, underway. Well, I used to be on my way to Russia once a year. That seems like kind of a strange thing to say, and it doesn't seem to make sense here. Okay, again, so it's repeated round trips. We used to go to Russia once a year and we would come back. Okay, so we need around, we need this type of picture. Now let's be careful. What type of motion is that? Did we walk to Russia? No, of course not. We took a vehicle there. So we have to be very careful. We would use here ездить. That would be the infinitive we're going to work with if we were translating this English sentence, right? Ездить, to make multiple round trips by vehicle. Number four, you used to go to class every day. Okay, again, same thing as to really, but now just in the past tense. But we still have the idea of repeated round trips on foot to class, now just in the past. So that would be, again, ходить, ходить. Right, by the way, if we were conjugating that, it would be ты ходил or ты ходила, right? You used to make round trips to class every day. Number five, where were you going? Okay, now let's think about this. To a friend on foot. Okay, so let's imagine we see a friend, they're on foot. Maybe we see them across the courtyard or whatever. And later we ask them, hey, where were you going? I saw you. Where were you going? Okay, well, let's visualize that in the moment. We spot someone and we see them kind of describing an arrow, right? They're going somewhere and we're wondering, where are they on their way to, right? There's the keyword, underway. Where were you underway to when I spotted you earlier today, right? Underway is the keyword. Uh, so they're on foot, so that's going to be et. Okay, and you may be seeing how some of these examples, even though we know the keywords, we have to really think rather carefully about what is really the type of motion that we're getting in this situation, right? Again, the English, as you've seen already, the go isn't helping us at all. Number six, you'd like to go to Russia frequently. Okay, well, again, so in some of these you can think of various possibilities and kind of use process of elimination. Does this mean you would like to be on your way to Russia frequently? Well, unless you really enjoy flying, and who does, right? That doesn't seem to make any kind of sense, right? If you'd like to go to Russia frequently, we're talking again, frequent round trips. Since this is a real journey with a vehicle, we're not going to walk, to Russia. That's going to be ездить, right? Frequent round trips to Russia by vehicle. Number 7, you were on a train to Moscow. Okay, sounds like our keyword is going to be underway, right? You were on your way by vehicle to Moscow. That's going to be ехать. Ехать will be the infinitive we'll work with. Number 8, the child knows how to walk. Okay, this is something we haven't quite seen yet. We'll see more examples later. If we're talking just about the motion as a general activity, then it doesn't have any determinateness sort of baked into it, right? So, for example, if we're talking about a baby who's learning how to walk, like that is to go on foot, that would be ходить, right? The baby knows how to ходить, right? It can walk around. That's kind of the idea of what a baby does, right? And sometimes in class, we'll see example after example here of, sometimes you can look at all three verbs potentially and think, well, if I use this one, what would it mean, right? And it's when you really look at the difference that you see how clear the distinction is between these three verbs, right? And so what would it mean if we said the child knows how to идти? Well, it would mean something like saying, again, let's use our keywords. The child knows how to be underway by foot, right? So what kind of sense does that make, right? You see how just kind of odd that is? And in class, I sometimes joke that, it sounds like the baby, instead of just kind of walking around the way toddlers do, like they're always on their way somewhere. It brings to mind one of these demonic Soviet babies we've seen in the poster where they're like they have this demonic kind of, they're trying to go somewhere like, ET, like the child is marching somewhere constantly as opposed to just, toddling around. Okay, so that's kind of a humorous example, but sometimes this can be fun just to juxtapose, let's assume you used all three verbs. What would each mean and what's the difference? And when you do that, usually the choice is even more clear than it might have been at the beginning. Okay, anyway, so number 8, the full translation of that would be Ребенок умеет ходить, right? It knows how to walk. Okay, number 9, we're walking around in the park. Okay, you see there we have the keyword walking around. That's ходить, ходить, right? They don't seem to be going anywhere in particular. They're just strolling around the park. Number 10, I'm on my way to New York. Okay, on my way, underway, you are in transit, you are headed to New York, you're on your way. That's obvious. Now, we assume that you're not walking to New York from, I don't know where that would even be, but okay, we assume this is a trip by vehicle, right? Ехать, ехать describes being underway by vehicle. Number 11, your friend never goes to class. Okay, again, here's one that at first glance here may seem a little bit weird. The tricky part here is maybe that we're negating this. What is the idea that we're negating? Well, going to class. We've already seen what is going to class in Russian. That's ходить, right? You go to class, you go there, you come back. That's repeated habitual round trips. Okay, so that's our basic idea here. We're just negating it, right? So не ходить would be the negated infinitive. We could say something like Мой друг никогда не ходит на занятия. He never goes to class. Он не ходит. Он не ходит на занятия. Okay, number 12, I'll go to class every day next semester. That's the same situation, but future tense. So that would be буду ходить. Okay, let's complete the picture by adding in now the third column, right? The third type of infinitive, the perfective, right? Now, the trickiest part, I guess, generally about verbs of motion has already been covered, right? It's that the distinction between the two imperfectives, right, where you get this determinate, indeterminate, all that stuff, right? The perfective is, it's perfective, right? So let's think what that means. Now, remember generally that imperfective verbs describe the sort of ongoing action, and often that's kind of extended in time, right? It's ongoing, could be present tense, right? Or it could be in the past, something that's ongoing. Like let's just take the verb ходить. If we start conjugating that, it could be я хожу, I am walking around, or past tense я ходил, I was walking around, or future, я буду ходить, I will be walking around. Okay, we'll talk more about that later about conjugation, but you see how that's an imperfective verb and it describes this ongoing action. Same thing with et, right? That could mean I am underway. It could also, as we'll see in a moment, mean I was underway or I will be underway, right? That underway is an imperfective action. Now you can just think what that means. It's an extended action that extends across time. It has duration, uh, right? Um, Now those imperfective verbs, as we mentioned, can also describe repetition, right? It can describe multiple round trips or multiple underways, so to speak, right? Being underway multiple times. Um, we could also think in terms of that third category, right? An attempt, right? If you say something like, what if we use yechet in the sense of being underway, being on our way to Moscow? We could think of that again as a process or as a kind of attempt, right? You're trying to make it to Moscow, right? So all of those different meanings are characteristic of any imperfective verb, and that includes these verbs of motion. Um, Remember, it seems like a simple point, but chadit iti, right? Those first two infinitives, they are both imperfective. They are both imperfective. One kind of stumbling block that a lot of students face, and too often it's because the textbook suggests that this is the case. And I remember this back when I was studying, right? You get the impression that chadit is more imperfective than iti, right? Well, no, right? It's logically nonsensical, right? Because it is imperfective by definition, right? These are both imperfective by definition. Um, Again, it's the determinacy category that makes the only distinction between these two verbs. Okay, now we'll see later that it may be statistically that indeed chadit is going to be used more often for repeated trips, just because often when we're talking about repeated trips, it's more likely that we're going to be talking about repeated round trips, right? Repeated completed trips as opposed to repeated underway actions, right? So you see how you take this distinction and you get in practice sort of a system where a situation where one verb may be statistically more likely to occur than the other. And so as a textbook writer or whatever, you take that and want to make it into a rule of thumb and again say, well, if we're talking about repetition, we're going to use chadit. No, right? Again, in terms of a kind of rule of thumb, that may hold up fairly well on a purely practical level. But we're not here for practicalities, right? We want to really know what is the difference, and we already know it. It's determinacy. Okay, so let's look at a table here, and this is a rather complete table. Again, it may be a bit of overkill. That's fine. We're trying to review what we know about aspect, and we're keeping all of that stuff in mind because we're still talking about aspect, but we're focused first on the difference between indeterminate and determinate. You see all that in the table, right? So note that all of that stuff, the details here are at the very bottom of this table. That's really maybe the most important content, right? The keywords, the pictograms. Let's go across before we get the new perfective verbs. Ходить and ездить describe motion around, to be going around, to make a round trip, to make multiple round trips, right? We throw in there the idea of repetition. Идти, ехать are determinate. Keyword is underway. They can mean to be underway, right, on a one-way trip, or to be underway on multiple, right, repeated, habitual, whatever it is, one-way trips. And you see the pictogram describes very clearly what that looks like. Okay, finally, the last category, perfective verbs. Okay, so we were reviewing just a moment ago that imperfective verbs are generally, they have duration in time. They're extended ongoing actions across time or they're repeated. Now remember, perfective verbs generally are basically bam, bam. They're kind of instantaneous. They don't have extension. They don't repeat. It's a one-time completed sort of wham bam type of action. Okay, so that's true of any imperfective verb. Now here we have something a little bit unusual, but it's something we've actually discussed, right? A verb like paiti, a perfective verb of motion, can be thought of as a verb of inception, a perfective of inception. We saw examples of this, like for example, любить, полюбить, right? Where the perfective polubit means to come to love something, right? It's not that you're finishing or completing loving someone. It's really the opposite. You're sort of, it's almost more like falling in love, although there is a different Russian verb for that. But polubit means you're sort of coming to love something. You have this instantaneous, in this case, the beginning of the ongoing action. Okay, paiti is, as you may have guessed already, the exact same situation. You are stationary. You use the verb paiti. It means you start walking. You set off. You head off or set off on foot. That's exactly what paiti means. Exactly. That is exactly what it means. Поехать is to set off by vehicle. You can imagine being still. You're not going anywhere. You're whatever it is you're doing, and off you go, right? So that's why in the pictogram, I usually like to draw, again, a vertical line, which just suggests someone kind of standing there, they're stationary, and then the arrow, right? Off they go. That's paiti, поехать. Okay, so, and again, you see how that's kind of momentary, right? Phew, off they go, right? They've started this walking or riding or driving or whatever it is, motion. Now, there's one more thing to say about these verbs, these perfective verbs. We're going to talk about this more later. If we use a verb like paiti, it means what we just said it means. It means to set off on foot. Okay, so for example, the phrase paiti v biblioteku means to set off for the library. Now note the kuda expression, right? Paiti v biblioteku. That means to set off on foot to the library, towards the library. Okay, now there's a little addendum here that's really important on a practical level. If we use this phrase, and later we'll learn how to use it in the past tense, but paiti v biblioteku, and let's say we use that in the past tense in the sense that he set off for the library. Where would you assume that this person is now? Right? If we said of him in the past tense, we use this phrase paiti v biblioteku. Well, of course, we'd assume that he's at the library. Right? So we're going to see that on a practical level, when we use a perfective verb, that's usually going to imply a completed one-way trip, right? Whether in the past or in the future, right? A one-way trip. Now we've already seen that round trips, those are indeterminate verbs. But it's important to note that that is only assumed, right? So if we say, again in Russian using paiti, he set off for the library, well, normally we would assume, well, he's probably at the library by now, right? But he could have been run over by a truck on his way to the library, right? Of course, we don't know. All we know is that he set off for the library. But again, on a practical level, we often assume that he completed his trip to the library. He arrived at the library. Okay, so verbs like paiti, поехать, perfective verbs of motion. The key word is setting out, setting out. That is exactly what the verb means. But on a practical level, we often assume arrival, right? So we have sort of a two-part kind of keyword, setting out and assumed arrival. But, and again, this comes up later, the arrival is only assumed, right? Now, while I'm thinking about it, people often ask, well, okay, then how do we know that they got to the library, right? Are we always only assuming, we're merely assuming people completed a one-way trip? Well, that's where prefix verbs of motion come in, and we're going to cover that starting in book 2. Okay, so yes, there is a way to make perfectly clear that someone arrived at a destination. There are actually a couple ways to do that. But again, in terms of just everyday Russian, you would sort of just by default, you would use paiti. Someone set off for wherever, and we assume they got there. Okay, so we're going to talk more about that later. Today we're just trying to we're trying to get the big picture of how the system works. Okay, let's look back at the table, and we see again our little pictograms, setting out or setting off, and assumed arrival. That's the second little pictogram, which I don't use too often, but you see it's kind of implying we're making it to our destination. But that is merely implied by the verb. The verb does not make clear that someone arrived. Okay, so yeah, setting off, making it somewhere on a one-way trip. Now, let's remember the obvious, right? These cannot be present tense. They're perfective verbs after all, right? So they can't describe ongoing action. They can't be used in the present tense, and they can't describe repetition either, right? Just like any perfective verb. Okay, so there's a lot to keep track of here. Let's look at a couple of examples and again, compare translations to unpacking the verb, and you'll see how useful I think this is. Now, here's an example that we just discussed actually. Он пошел в библиотеку. That is the past tense of пойти. More on that in a moment. Okay, so он пошел в библиотеку. Translated, he went to the library. Okay, now let's think that could mean a couple of things in Russian. Did he make a round trip to the library? Did he set up, what's going on here? Okay, so the English is actually somewhat vague. The Russian is not. Он пошел в библиотеку. We could unpack that as he set off or he set out on foot for the library. That's exactly what the Russian means. Again, we assume that he's probably at the library. If he set out, we assumed his arrival, but we don't know that. Okay, another example. Она поедет в Россию. Okay, there's a future tense, right? Perfective. She'll go to Russia. Okay, well, again, the English is quite vague. Does that mean she'll complete one trip to Russia? She'll make multiple trips to Russia? It seems kind of confusing. Okay, well, the Russian, she will set out by vehicle for Russia. That's exactly what the Russian means. You see that that means basically that she's leaving for Russia. We assume also that she will arrive in Russia. We assume that she'll make it to Russia. Okay, more on this example later because that actually involves one of the breakdowns, and we're going to cover that later. So for now, let's look at some more examples, right, in terms of completion. Он пошел в библиотеку. Okay, he went to the library. Now again, we assume usually that means that it strongly implies that he made it to the library. Or она поедет в Россию, that means certainly she'll set off for Russia, she'll set out for Russia, and we assume she'll make it there, right? So again, that's the assumed arrival situation. Okay, let's look at some other tables and look at how to conjugate these verbs. Now, to make matters more difficult, in these first two sets of motion verbs, right? Motion by foot, motion by vehicles, we have two irregular verbs. So let's look at these and just learn how to conjugate them. And you should just drill this, right? If you, like with any verb, you really need to just kind of drill it. And that's especially true of irregular verbs, right? They don't belong to a type. You just have to memorize these unusual forms. Okay, so again, here are our three infinitives, ходить, идти, пойти. Let's start with ходить. How do we conjugate that? Well, it's an e-verb, right? So it's actually normal. And hopefully, the e-verbs, we've seen so many of them, I hope they're not giving us too much trouble. This is a shifting stress verb. Хожу, right, there's our mutation in the ya form only. Ходишь, ходит, ходим, ходите, ходит. Okay, past tense. As we know, those are usually easy, straight from the infinitive. Ходил, ходила, ходила, ходили. What about future tense? Okay, you see here we're leaving no stone unturned, right? We're giving all the tense forms just to be perfectly clear. But this is entirely predictable, right? We have an imperfective verb. Those are going to form their future tense using the helping verb, right? Я буду ходить, ты будешь ходить, right? Будет ходить, будем ходить, будете ходить, будут ходить. Right? Remember, we are conjugating the budu, right? The forms of that helping verb, and that's followed by the infinitive. Ходить, ходить, ходить. Okay, идти. No verb type marker there. This is an irregular verb. Now, as with quite a few of these irregular verbs and also some unusual verb types, a lot of them take your ending. So really the only trick here is remembering the stem, which is id. Okay, if you remember that, it's pretty easy. Иду, идешь, идет, идем, идете, идут. Okay, past tense is also irregular for this verb. So this is a doubly irregular verb. And as we know, irregularities in the past are even more unusual than irregularities in the present. So this is a pretty wacky verb. I'll just tell you quickly if you're wondering. Shell, that form historically is related to chod. It's the same root, and you've got a bizarre um, consonant mutation that happened historically. That's again, it looks very unusual, but again, if you're just wondering where on earth did they get this form shol, it's actually from, uh, it's a form of chod. Now we see here that the de has dropped out of the past tense forms. Okay, so it's kind of a long story. It's not worth getting into, but just pointing out that there is a reason for this. We don't need to know what it is. We just need to learn the forms. Shol, shla, shlo, shli. Okay, future. Again, this is an imperfective verb, so it's going to follow the rule. It's going to use the helping verb. Буду идти, будешь идти, будете идти, будем идти, будете идти, будут идти. Okay, let's take this opportunity because these underway verbs tend to be the ones that kind of throw people for a loop. So let's just look at how the keyword can help us. How can we translate these present tense forms? Иду, идешь, идет, etc. Well, let's take a stab at it. I am underway by foot. You are underway by foot. He, she, or it is underway by foot. We are underway by foot. You, plural, or you, polite, are underway by foot. They are underway by foot. Again, that is the exact meaning of these verbs. Exact meaning. So as long as we capture the type of motion, right, namely on foot, and the keyword underway, right, we're really understanding what this Russian verb is conveying. Past tense, shol, shla, shlo, shli. He was underway by foot, she was underway by foot, it was underway by foot, they were underway by foot, right? Буду идти, будешь идти, etc. in the future. I will be underway by foot. You will be underway by foot. He, she, or it will be underway by foot. We will be underway by foot. You, plural, or you, polite, will be underway by foot. They will be underway by foot. Okay, so you see how if you're kind of diligent about this and you insist on unpacking the Russian very precisely, then you will get a very precise picture of what the Russian means. Now, again, that may be kind of a starting point. It's much better, of course, to just kind of spontaneously picture the type of motion in your head. So you may try transitioning from the keyword to sort of envisioning the pictogram. Okay, what about paiti? Well, it's perfective. It can't be used in the present tense. We know that very well at this point. Okay, now you can look at that paiti and you can see that it's basically a version of iti, but we have a little difference in spelling. But again, we can see that essentially it's a form of iti with po added in front of it. So that helps us explain the forms we're seeing here. Past tense, pashol, pashla, pashlo, pashli. He set out by foot, she set out by foot, it set out by foot, they set out by foot. Okay, now if we just simply conjugate paiti, again, we get verbs that look like et with a po in front of it. Now note the ikratkaya, right? Again, a slight spelling difference, but essentially these look a lot like the forms we already learned. Пойду, пойдешь, пойдет, пойдем, пойдете, пойдут. I will set out by foot, you will set out by foot, he, she, it will set out by foot, etc. Okay, let's look at our next verb, ездить, ехать, поехать. Okay, this is the motion by vehicle verb. Okay, let's not spend all day on this. I'll just read through the forms quickly. If we look over, you see ездить is an e-verb, another e-verb. We get that final de in the stem mutating to je in the ya form only. So a bit funny looking, but entirely predictable. Often you won't even hear the ze pronounced. You'll simply hear yeju, yeju, right? Yeju, ездишь, ездит, ездим, ездите, ездит. Past tense is easy. Ездил, ездила, ездила, ездили. Future tense, compound form. Буду ездить, будешь ездить, будет ездить, будем ездить, будете ездить, будут ездить. Okay, ехать, also irregular, but again, pretty easy. We just need to know the stem, which is yed, yed. Okay, еду, едешь, едет, едем, едете, едут. Past tense, again, as almost always happens, it's very, very predictable. Ехал, ехала, ехала, ехали. Future tense. Будешь ехать. Буду ехать, будешь ехать, будет ехать, будем ехать, будете ехать, будут ехать. Поехать. Okay, it's simply ехать with a pull in front of it, right, with that prefix. Past tense, поехал, поехала, поехала, поехали, right? He set out by vehicle, she set out by vehicle, etc. Future tense, right, we simply conjugate the verb. Поеду, поедешь, поедет, поедем, поедете, поедут. I will set out by vehicle, you will set out by vehicle, etc. Okay, so one part of your homework, I guess, for tomorrow would be hopefully to memorize these forms, right? They're a little bit tricky, especially the, right, et and diechet, they're irregular verbs. Okay, a few more items today. Let's look quickly at breakdowns in the system of motion verbs. Now let's look at some examples here using our imperfective verbs. Now we know that those can be used in any tense. And again, what we need to kind of do two things at once starting tomorrow. We need to think about the system and just remember that it is kind of a system. You've seen that already. It's these three verbs have distinct meanings, and those meanings are carried over pretty nicely across the tenses, right? In accordance with aspectual possibilities, right? So let's look at examples here of how two sets of imperfective verbs that are carried across all three tenses, and the meaning is essentially the same. On идет, on шел, on будет идти. He is underway by foot, he was underway by foot, he will be underway by foot. There are the three unpacked versions. The only difference here is tense, right? Let's take ходить. Он ходит в школу, он ходил в школу, он будет ходить в школу. Right? He makes round trips, he made round trips, he will make round trips to school, or as we normally say, he goes to school. He went to school, he will go to school. We're thinking in terms of repeated round trips. Okay, now to preview, starting tomorrow, we're going to start introducing, I believe there are five of what we'll refer to as breakdowns, right? Where this nice little system we just learned is going to behave in unexpected ways in some very specific, very, well, not unusual, but just very specific examples. Okay, so anyway, more on that tomorrow. Okay, let's do a few more, just getting some English examples. Let's try to capture the gist of the English by choosing an appropriate infinitive. Again, for now, we're just choosing an infinitive. We could conjugate it and put it in the right tense and everything, but we're really just trying to focus on which of these three infinitives we're going to use to translate this given example or to express it in Russian. Okay, you will attend classes every day next semester. Okay, again, that's repeated round trips. That's easy. The keyword is around. The pictogram is a circle. The infinitive is ходить, right? Because we're walking to class. Okay, we'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow. Number two, you never go to classes. Okay, we've done that already. We're negating the idea of multiple round trips, right? Repeated habitual round trips. The keyword is around. The pictogram is a circle. The infinitive is, again, ходить. Ты никогда не ходишь на занятия. Number three, you were walking to class. Okay, now, again, let's think carefully. I mean, we don't need to try to cook up some extravagant situation, right? It sounds like an underway example, right? You were walking to class. After all, we could paraphrase that to say you were on your way to class. Okay, so keyword is underway. The pictogram is an arrow, right? And the infinitive is идти, идти. Ты шел на занятие would be the translation. Or ты шла. Number four, your friend left for class. Okay, off they went. Sounds like they just set off for class, right? So the key word would be setting out or setting off. Pictogram would be an arrow with a little base on it, right, to show that we're starting off motionless and then setting off. And the infinitive will be пойти, пойти. Number five, where's Jane? Well, she went off to class. Okay, so she's gone, same situation. Keyword is a setting off or heading out or something like that. Pictogram, again, an arrow with the base on it. And the infinitive, пойти. Number 6, Jane went to class this morning, now she's home. That's a round trip. Okay, so she's not simply setting off for class. I mean, she did that originally, of course, but now she's back home. So the motion we're describing now is a completed round trip. So the keyword is around, or more specifically, round trip. The pictogram is a circle. The infinitive is ходить. Okay, number 7, where's Bob? He's gone to Russia. Okay, sounds like he hasn't come back from Russia. So it's not that he's completed a round trip, it's just that he's set off for Russia. Keyword is setting off. The pictogram is the arrow with the little base on it. And the infinitive is поехать. We need поехать because going to Russia involves a vehicle, right? You can't possibly go there on foot. Okay, number 8, Bob went to Russia last year, now he's back home. Okay, now we have the completed round trip. It requires a vehicle. Keyword is around, or more specifically, round trip. Pictogram is a circle. The infinitive is ездить. Он ездил в Россию. Number 9, Bob used to go to Russia often. Okay, let's think about that. Repeated round trips. Okay, we're in the past, but we're talking about Bob's repeated trips to Russia, that is, repeated round trips in the past. Keyword is around or round trips. Pictogram is, the clearest way to do this would be to repeat the circle, right, the little circular arrow, because we're talking about repeated trips. The infinitive is ездить, right? Bob часто ездил в Россию. Number 10, Jane has never been to Russia. Okay, now again, this negation can sometimes be a bit confusing. What we're really saying is that, we're not really saying so much that she never set off for Russia. That sounds kind of weird in English, right? Well, Jane has never set off for Russia, right? When would we say that, right? Similarly, we wouldn't really say, well, Jane has never been on her way to Russia, right? I mean, it would be some kind of very specific, very bizarre situation where we would even say that. Okay, so the idea we're really negating here in terms of the Russian is ездить, right? She's never made a round trip to Russia, period, right? Our keyword is around, right? Because we're talking about round trip. The pictogram is a a circular arrow, and infinitive is ездить. Jane никогда не ездила в Россию would be the translation. Okay, let's try to unpack a few of these Russian examples. Моя подруга всегда ходит на урок. My friend always goes to class. Okay, now if we unpack that, ходить, repeated round trips. My friend makes repeated round trips to class, if we're just unpacking that very literally. Number 2, куда ты шел вчера, когда я тебя увидел в коридоре? Where were you underway to on foot, right? Шел is someone was underway by foot. Where were you on your way to by foot when I spotted you in the hallway? Number 3, вчера я ходила в театр на балет. Yesterday, I made a round trip by foot to the theater for a ballet. Made a round trip by foot. Now, we'll talk more about that example tomorrow. That could involve a breakdown, so more to be said on that tomorrow. Number 4, завтра они поедут в Россию на 2 месяца. Tomorrow, they will set off by vehicle to Russia for 2 months. Okay, setting off. Right, поехать means to set off by vehicle, to set out by vehicle. Number 5, куда она пошла? Where did she set off to on foot? Where did she head off to on foot? Не знаю, на лекцию, может быть. Right, I don't know, maybe to a lecture. Я долго ходила в парке и думала о русской литературе. I walked around in the park for a long time and thought about Russian literature. Okay, so ходила here is someone was walking around on foot. They were walking around, they were going around on foot in the park and thinking about Russian literature. Okay, that's enough by way of introduction. We'll look at these in much more detail over the next several days, and we'll also introduce these notorious breakdowns. And once we do all of that, we will be experts in the use of Russian verbs of motion. Okay, until next time, до свидания, товарищи.